Great, let's get started then. Welcome to everyone who's here in Dundee, and welcome also to all the 38 Degrees members who are joining this conversation live through the power of the internet, or who are watching it later. We'll be taking questions from those of you that are watching online down the internet as well as from in the room. So please, as you're watching proceedings, please be thinking about what you would like to ask. So first of all, I'd like to say welcome to Stewart Hosie, who is Deputy Leader of the Scottish National Party. I'll give a little bit of introduction and then get straight over to hearing first from Stewart and then from all of you. So we're meeting here today to talk about tax dodging and particularly to talk about a tax loophole called the Mayfair loophole. 38 Degrees members first voted to campaign about tax dodging a good number of years ago. I think probably the first thing we did was lots of 38 Degrees members from all around the UK donated to run newspaper adverts depicting George Osborne as the artful dodger around the time of his first budget back in 2011, I guess it was. And since then, we've done all kinds of campaigning on the issue. Most recently, 38 Degrees members clubbed together to hire in tax experts to do an investigation into tax dodging. And they exposed a particular loophole, which we've called the Mayfair loophole, a loophole which benefits mainly private equity fund managers, enabling them to pay a much lower rate of tax on their income than that which you'd expect anyone else to be paying. Our estimate is that this loophole is enabling these private equity managers, very wealthy people, to avoid up to £700 million worth of tax. And that's obviously both a very large sum of money and a great injustice, and also a great example of a wider problem and a good test of whether politicians are willing to ruffle the feathers and get tough on tax dodging in the way that will be necessary if we are to see a real effort to tackle tax dodging. So thanks to the efforts of 38 Degrees members in highlighting this loophole and having conversations with politicians about it, a number of political parties seeking our votes in this general election have now committed to closing the loophole. The Green Party, the Labour Party and the Scottish National Party have all pledged to shut this loophole, which is very, very welcome. And we're at the phase of the campaign now where we're hearing from those politicians and kind of quizzing them in a bit more detail to invite them to flesh out where they stand on tax dodging and how they intend to act should they form part of the next government. So that's really, I think that will do from me by way of introduction. What I'd like to do now is give Stewart a few minutes to set out the SNP's position on tax dodging, both in general and specifically the Mayfair loophole, and then we'll go over to questions. So Stewart.
Thank you very much indeed. At its heart, when we talk about tax dodging, tax avoidance, tax evasion, it's actually about tax fairness, because every penny lost when someone doesn't pay what they're due is a penny lost to public services and all the other essential things that we depend upon. So we're very clear indeed, it needs to be clamped down on, and it's completely wrong. Now that's easy to say. So what is it we're actually going to do? Well, there are a number of things. We've said there has to be a rolling review of reliefs, because many of the reliefs which exist are there to do a job to provide safer investment. They deliver what it says on the tin. But as times change, and we've seen this with tax relief on films, for example, people benefit from a relief that it wasn't designed for. And we need to find out when that's happening. That relief is either narrowed or removed, or if it's doing precisely what it was designed to do, then of course it's able to continue. We think that's incredibly important. Of course, the specific issue that falls from that is the Mayfair loophole. Now again, technically, this is carry relief on investment. And if that actually delivers an investment, that's great. But the argument that 38 Degrees made was that the money being put in, it wasn't the fund manager's money, it was other people's money, but the whole of the tax relief was going to the fund manager, and that's probably an abuse of the relief, so we were more than happy to say yes, that should be shut down. So there's a whole variety of things, specific things we'd want to do, not least because even the avoidance and evasion aspect is leading to something like 7.5 billion of uncollected tax. And that's before we get into the errors and the complexity in the tax code, some 11,000 pages. And so I think we should do all of these things, but it's not just domestic, it's international as well. And there have been huge calls for a global tax justice summit. So we back that in the manifesto. We're very supportive of the country-by-country reporting, in a sense, so that the individuals, organisations like yourselves can actually follow the money and find out if there's a specific problem in another country where money's leaking from, and where it's going if there's tax issues there as well. So a whole variety of things covering the domestic, covering the international, and making sure that people pay what they're due to pay so that we all benefit from the public services the taxes provide.
Thank you. Are there any questions from within the room to start with?
I'll ask one.
Lynn.
One of the questions that I thought was quite important is that obviously we're working towards closing these loopholes, but there are lots of times in the past where people have tried to close loopholes, and I'm just wondering, what is the chance of actually closing this loophole, and perhaps when is that likely to happen?
Right. This closing specific loopholes in the past, even with the UK government, can happen quite quickly. But you're right, sometimes particular reviews of taxation to find out where the problems are can take years. So in the interim, both the UK and the Scottish government now have anti-avoidance rules. So that if you're using a scheme or a loophole in order to avoid paying tax, that can be stopped. And I think the key thing here, and the key difference actually between Westminster and Scotland, is that the Scottish anti-avoidance principle is based on artificiality, not just abuse. Abuse is much more difficult to prove. And I think until we can shut down the specific loopholes, complete the review of all the reliefs, it's absolutely right that we follow the view the Scottish government are doing, that if someone is creating an artificial construct to benefit from the tax code in a way it wasn't designed for, then that can be stopped extremely quickly indeed.
Excellent. That's very good to know.
So there have been a few questions online along these lines as well, and I think some of our members have been asking online kind of, do you think if the SNP had a say, would you want to see measures to close this particular loophole in the first finance bill, or do you feel that this particular loophole has to wait for a wider?
No, that particular loophole is identified. Now, clearly, when people are drafting legislation, when the civil servants, the officials, people from the revenue are looking at this, they need to make sure if something's going to be closed, there are no unintended consequences. I think that's important, sure. But there's no reason, with that caveat that it's got to be done properly, that it can't be done quickly.
Great. Thank you. Have we got any other questions from the room? Okay. Well, there's loads coming in online. So let's while you think of some in the room that you'd like to ask, let me take some from Facebook and from the live stream. So Ray is asking. Lots of politicians from lots of parties talk about their desire to close tax loopholes, but they either haven't managed or haven't wanted to, really. What makes the SNP different?
Well, to be fair, there has been some progress on this at Westminster, and that's to be welcomed, but there's always more that can be done. I think it becomes more of a priority when we see the public sector and public services under pressure, when we see a continuing deficit, when we still see debt being racked up. There's an imperative for government to maximise the tax it legitimately brings in, and I think closing loopholes is important. Now, clearly the size of the tax gap is something that people debate. Is it 35 billion in total? Is it the big figures of over 100 billion? Is it the 7 or 8 billion the revenue suggests, which is down to avoidance and evasion only? In a sense, it doesn't matter because these are all huge numbers. This is all revenue we cannot afford to forego. So I think there's an imperative, and it's interesting in this election, every party, I think, has included in its manifesto tax evasion, tax avoidance measures, bringing in 5, 6, 7 billion over the period. I think that's quite important that there's been a shift in political opinion to say this is now essential and is an imperative to do it. The other thing I would say is an issue of fairness. How can it be right that some people or some businesses at least have the impression of getting away with not paying substantial amounts of tax when someone can be sanctioned and lose their benefits, have nothing to eat, for being 5 minutes late for a meeting? And I think when we overlay humanity on top of that and fairness, I think we deliver collectively the priority that this perhaps hasn't had in the past.
So Kay is kind of offering a theory, I guess, for why other parties haven't done as much as we might like to have seen. She talks about vested interest and the backlash that you might see from, I guess, in the case of the Mayfair loophole, the current beneficiaries of the Mayfair loophole. And she wants to know, how would your party deal with such a backlash? How would you stand up to those who benefit from tax avoidance and tax evasion at the moment?
Just think, I mean, if taxes have to go up, and we think the 50p rate of tax should definitely be reinstated, there should never have been a tax cut for millionaires in the first place. I'm delighted that the SNP called the vote and voted against the millionaires tax cut. So we can take those decisions when it's right to do so. By the same token, if one looks at, say, the North Sea oil and gas industry, we were extremely critical of the massive hike in tax at the start of this Parliament, which suppressed and basically stopped investment for 2 years. So you've got to weigh every decision up in turn. But the Scottish National Party are well able and have either voted for increased taxes where it was necessary, or indeed stopping increased taxes where that was in the national interest. So it's getting the balance right every time, and it's taking those tough decisions. But the key thing is also the Scottish Government. They've had to take decisions on tax, whether it's business rates, whether it's new land and properties tax. They've had to take these decisions, difficult decisions, changing rates, adjusting rates, and they have to do that every year. So we're more than able to do it. And the key point is the one I said in the previous answer. Because we're now not just looking at tax fairness, but an imperative to bring in the tax due to fund the public services, now, I think it makes decisions like this much easier this time.
Cool. Shall I? Oh, we've got another question in there.
Speak straight into the mic, is that okay? Put it right up.
I tell you what, why don't I repeat the question so that they can be heard down the live stream as well?
One of the things that I was worried about was how it's the attitude of the people who are claiming these tax loopholes. And I just wondered, I think it goes on from your question there about how would you deal with the attitude of those people? Is there possibly, they should be thinking about what their damage to the economy is and their damage to the ordinary person. Perhaps they just don't even care.
So what do we think about the attitude of people who use these tax loopholes? Why?
I don't think you can legislate for that. Clearly, your members can make the case that paying your tax, paying the tax due, if it's fair and competitive, is the right thing to do because all of us benefit from the services that the taxes provide. But I don't think you can legislate for people's personal viewpoints. This is in essence a technical matter. Right. This is a calculation, and here's the tax bill. It's got to be fair, it's got to be proportionate, but it's got to be paid. And that's what you can legislate for.
So Amy online has quite a good follow-up to that. Maybe you can't criminalise attitudes, but she wants to know if you would criminalise financial advisors who design and facilitate tax evasion schemes. I think she's maybe thinking, for example, of the HSBC operation.
There's been a huge amount of work done in the UK on the promoters of those schemes. Massive amount of work, and that's to be very much welcomed. The issue with the HSBC stuff was that was their Swiss private client bank. Clearly, you can't legislate for that here. That has to be done in other countries. But the more international coordination there is on this, the better, which is why I said at the beginning, having a global tax justice summit is something we very much welcome and support, because it's not just a loss to our public services, it's a loss to public services around the world, particularly in many of the countries who are developing and need that cash most.
John on Facebook wants to know what the SNP would do about multinationals like Starbucks or Amazon and other companies who export their profits to low tax tax havens.
Well, just be ever so slightly careful that when we're talking about people avoiding tax, it's real tax due. Now, there's nothing wrong with having an international business, so long as you do pay the tax where it is due. But there is certainly a serious issue about offshoring profits and keeping the liabilities in the UK. Now, again, there's been some progress towards that with overseas-owned companies. I think there's probably more to be done there. And I think the country-to-country reporting aspect of some of the new financial regulation will help a great deal to look at the flows of money, where it's going, where the tax is being paid, and indeed where it's not. The bottom line should be pretty straightforward. Tax liability should follow the economic activity. And the more that broad ethos can be applied, I think the fairer the tax code will be in terms of actually taxing the legitimate profits which are made in this country.
Would you agree that at the moment there does seem to be a gap between, say, the amount of warehouses, deliveries, customers that some of these big online companies have in the UK and the amount of tax they seem to be paying?
I wouldn't dispute that at all, which is why even this last Tory Liberal government introduced overseas profit tax precisely to tackle that problem. I mean, it can't just be a case of where is the order processed in a remote server. You know, where is the actual order fulfilled and facilitated from? Where is the real profit made? Absolutely.
Great. Any more questions from in the room right now? Great. Well, you're giving the people on Facebook plenty of chance. So Sean's got a question about the future. I think you've alluded to this already, that tax avoidance is quite a creative industry, yes. And new loopholes are always being found and exploited. What would be the SNP's approach to catching new tax loopholes and closing them as they emerge?
Well, there's two things. As I said earlier, the rolling review of reliefs helps a lot because we can remove reliefs that are being abused and are no longer fit for purpose. Mm-hmm. That's helpful. Clearly, people are going to be very imaginative, but I think the Scottish Government's anti-avoidance principle is the key one. If it's artificial, then it's wrong. It's not just a case that someone in the revenue has to prove abuse. If it's self-evidently artificial, and I think the UK government should adopt this artificiality as a primary driver in their squeezing out of tax avoidance rather than necessarily artificiality and abuse.
Could I just, on that, could you explain how you'd implement that rolling review, just if people are wondering?
So that's a question about implementation of a rolling review. How would that come about?
Well, clearly we've had reviews of the tax code in the past, and sadly they've taken a long time. But I think if people in the revenue or others were charged with looking at all of the reliefs that exist, perhaps starting with the ones that are most used, to identify whether they deliver what they're meant to deliver, whether that's investment or some other aspect of business life, great. If it's identified quickly that there's a particular relief that isn't doing what it does on the tin, then there's no reason at all why that can't come to Parliament quickly, either in the next finance bill or a separate piece of legislation to be looked at, changed, amended, or indeed removed if it's no longer fit for purpose.
Paul.
You talked there about legislation being required. What are the chances of it getting through the Lords?
So that's a question about the House of Lords and legislation.
Well, I think common sense will prevail. I mean, the House of Lords can stop a number of things, they can delay a number of things, but if there's a self-evidently fair and sensible change to the tax code, you know, it's inconceivable that that would be blocked in any way.
David Bogue asks an interesting question, given there's the current state of the polls and an election coming up. He's interested to know how you rate and how you'd compare other parties' positions on tax avoidance. Who do you think has what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of other parties' positions?
Most of the parties are taking a broadly similar view. I think we've probably been more specific on the rolling review of reliefs. Certainly looking at things like the gaming of the non-dom status. There's general acceptance, certainly between ourselves and Labour. That's the right approach to take. I don't actually, to be brutally honest, see a huge difference in approach. All I would say is our motivation here is really good. We think there's an imperative to do it. And I think the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Who's most keen to see this perhaps in a Queen's speech, to see this in an early finance bill, to put in place the review I was talking about, and we'll certainly push extremely hard to make that happen.
I'm just being warned we've got about 5 minutes left, so if you have got a question, please post it online or get your hand up if you're in the room quickly. Yeah, an interesting response actually to what you've just said there about getting it in the Queen's speech and getting on with it. If you were in coalition negotiations, how high a priority would tax dodging be for you? What would be your top demands? Would closing the Mayfair loophole, given, as you acknowledge, it's been identified and it does seem to be a clear abuse, would that be a red line for you?
No, I wouldn't say closing a particular loophole in terms of tax relief would be a red line, but clearly it's very important. Given we've cited it and said we'd like to see it shut, given we've said we want the Global Tax Summit, given we've said we want the rolling review of reliefs, given that we want to change the anti-avoidance principle to be based on artificiality because that's a better thing to do, we'd be very keen, and these are all manifesto commitments, we'd be very keen indeed to see these enacted early. Now, I don't think there's going to be coalition negotiations, but if this is done on a vote-by-vote basis, if Labour need to speak to us to get a Queen's speech through, these are certainly things which are in our manifesto and we would like to see implemented. And
I guess, therefore, could 38 Degrees members expect an SNP bloc in Westminster being active on this issue, pushing amendments?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the points that has been made in terms of the politics of what might happen after the election if the polls are accurate. You know, if we were faced with a take it or leave it situation from Labour, then if there was a finance bill, you know, or other legislation, absolutely amendments covering all the areas we spoke about are precisely the things we'd want to table and see enacted, yes.
I think that's probably where this question was going, actually. So I think that's something that 38 Degrees members would be quite interested to hear more about from the SNP, is how if we are campaigning for loopholes to be closed, will the SNP be willing to hear from 38 Degrees members as we identify loopholes, as we have with the Mayfair loophole, and consider ways that they can speak up for them being closed within Parliament?
Well, not only would we be happy to hear from 38 Degrees in terms of new loopholes, but I would hope that 38 Degrees would bring as much pressure as they possibly could. If, for example, there was a progressive amendment to try and close one of these loopholes down, just to make sure that if it was a minority Labour administration, or indeed another government, they were kept on the straight and narrow and they understood the strength of public opinion.
That's maybe quite a good place to end this. I think it's fair to say that 38 Degrees members will be interested on keeping all politicians on the straight and narrow on the issue of tax avoidance. Thank you very much to everyone that's come to Dundee for this meeting, to everyone that's watching on the internet, and of course to Stewart from the SNP for coming here and answering our questions. I think we can all agree this has been a really interesting conversation, and lots of follow-up action points for the coming months, I think, as well. Thank you.